Morning, everybody. Friday, the 27th, be our last day before spring break, which I know y'all are looking forward to, even if it probably is not going to be exactly what I think most of us had envisioned it would be. I know our plan was to head down to the beach, and instead, I will be home doing my wife's honey-do list. Um, anyway, it has been a crazy 2 weeks as we've done this online school thing. You may have seen the message that was sent out to parents that we're going to at least be doing this through, I think it's April 24th, which means for really the next, I guess by the next month, we're going to be doing everything online. So hopefully you're working it out, figuring out how to schedule it to get everything done. And hopefully things are going to go smoother in the days ahead. I would really encourage you, if you've got anything that you haven't turned in yet, these next few days are a great time to do that. Nobody's going to be adding work. At least they shouldn't be adding much work to anything you're doing. I don't think most teachers will. So take advantage of that. I'm going to send out a list later today of things that I'm missing. Maybe you thought you turned it in and it just hadn't been turned in yet. What we want to do here for the few minutes we have today is we want to look at this Book of Ruth. It's just really, it's one of my favorite stories, and just it's this little gem of a book of, man, how God works even when we may not even see him working, that he's always behind the scenes working things out. I think a verse from Romans 8:28, how God works all things together for good to those that love him and are called according to his purpose. And for this time, as we're dealing with the coronavirus and our lives just being turned upside down, I think it's just a great message and great reminder. So I was really glad that Ruth came along this time. Just give you a step ahead. We're going to do Ruth today. Hopefully you've already watched the video and did the questions and that. It's only a 4-chapter book. Come back from spring break. We'll do a review over Joshua, Judges, and Ruth and have a test, and then we'll jump into the monarchy of Israel and what was going on in there. So let's go ahead and start looking at the book of Ruth. Let me go minimize this and you can see what it is. Hey, what's so unique about Ruth? One is this takes place during the time of the Judges. We're not sure exactly when, but takes place during the time of the Judges. They estimate maybe sort of in the middle period. We think maybe Samuel wrote the book and wrote the story down. So it's one that would have been passed along. And probably the reason why is because Ruth becomes the great-grandmother of David, who is probably considered the greatest king of Israel. It's one of only 2 books, along with Esther, that bears the name of a woman, which is pretty unique and special in that day and time. If you remember, we talked before, women were really considered just to be property, and so to have a book of the Bible named after a woman that she would be one of the main characters is pretty unique. We've already seen some of the things where God uses women. Deborah as a judge, Rahab the prostitute, who also is in the genealogy and line of Christ. 2 Gentiles, both Ruth and Rahab, who are in the genealogy of Christ, and how God uses and weaves all of mankind into his plan for a Messiah and a Redeemer. We know the basic story of Ruth. Naomi, her husband and 2 sons, probably because of a famine, I think it says a famine that was going on in Israel, moved to Moab, who was traditionally one of Israel's enemies. That shows you how bad it was in Israel at the time. While there, her sons marry, but her husband dies. And then soon after that, her 2 sons died, and she's left with 2 daughter-in-laws. And she encourages them. She decides she's going back to Israel, to Bethlehem particularly, and she really encourages her daughter-in-laws to not follow her because it's going to be hard for them. It was hard for an unmarried woman to take care of herself, much less in a nation that wasn't your own. But Ruth, in an incredible display of loyalty, says, no, I'm going to stay with you. And she gives this beautiful phrasing. You often hear it at weddings of, hey, your God will be my God. Your people be my people. I will never leave you. And that's what she commits to Naomi rather. And so they head back to Bethlehem. Uh, you answered the questions. It talked about, sort of what was the practice of the day. Uh, Remember, we said before in Deuteronomy, one of the things we looked at is when we talked about God forming a new nation, that he wanted them to be different. One of the things was he wanted them to take care of the poor, to take care of the widows, to take care of the strangers or the aliens. That God wanted Israel to be a different kind of country, a different kind of nation and people. That instead of, either ignoring them or abusing them or driving out the aliens, is just take care of them. And so that was a command that they do. And you're going to see this come to play with Boaz. Well, one of the things they had during that time was called gleaning. And it was a custom there for the Jews that when they harvested their crops, they would sort of leave the droppings on the ground. And so after the farmer harvested, there'd still be crops there that would fall on the ground and stuff. And that's what poor people would come and get. And they'd use that for their food. And that's one of the ways they took care of the poor there. It's kind of cool. They didn't just give it to them. They still had to work for it. But it was there if they were willing to work to pick it up and to get it. And so she does that. Ruth goes and does that to gather food for her and Naomi. And it just happens to be a relative of Naomi's, this guy named Boaz. And if you read the story, it's this thing that he notices her and he shows her special favor, and mainly because she's a relative and she's been good to Naomi, probably his cousin. And he even is the video review talked about, he even prays that God would bless Ruth, not realizing that he was going to be the one that God used to bless her. What are some of the other things? One, it's how God uses all sorts of people. In the video review, I love the thing they pulled out was that the only time God's mentioned, it's mentioned by the characters themselves. You don't see the story, okay, well, God did this or God did that, told by whoever was writing the story, maybe Samuel. It was really just in the words of the characters that it does. And so, again, it's this beautiful picture that as we remain faithful to God, man, God's working in the background. God is doing those things to provide for our needs. He is weaving his picture of us. I love the illustration of a tapestry that, when you look at a tapestry, you see it from the front and everything's this really cool, neat picture that they've made by just weaving thread together. But if you turn a tapestry around, it is this chaotic mass of threads that don't look like anything. Well, that's sort of the way we see things now. We look at what's going on with the coronavirus. We look at how our lives have been disrupted. And it's easy to think, okay, God, what is going on? I don't see you at all. What's happening here? And yet, God is weaving the pattern of our lives, even in the times we can't see it, as he did with Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. That Naomi, remember, she changed her name to Mara, meaning bitter. She was going back to Bethlehem, and she was a sad, bitter woman. And she didn't understand the good things that God was doing in the background for her there. Ruth eventually sort of makes this really bold, almost like a proposition. And that's one of the reasons it was so bold. To be honest, she easily could have been mistaken for being a prostitute, which is often what women did. Especially a woman without a husband. There wasn't a lot of ways for them to take care of themselves. And by laying down at Boaz's feet, there was this, she almost could have been seen the wrong way. And yet she trusted in Boaz's character. It's emphasized, one of the things it talks about a man of noble character, and later on it calls Ruth a woman of noble character. And her character just shone through. Boaz knew this wasn't a woman saying, here, just take me, but it was, hey, will you take me as your wife? And pretty bold. Maybe we do have women this day that would be that kind of bold today. I think sometimes things have turned around. But it was really, I think, an act of obedience, listening to her mother-in-law, Naomi. It was God working out a plan to take care of them. As we book concludes, we see that, Boaz takes on that role of a kinsman redeemer, and that's sort of where we get a connection to Christ here. That Jesus is our kinsman redeemer. Jesus, in the same way that Boaz redeemed the land of Naomi and redeemed them from poverty, Jesus, our kinsman redeemer, he redeems us from the curse of death. He takes on that debt of sin that we have so that we wouldn't have to take it. It's also this neat picture of taking care of those that are in need. And in this time, we've got lots of chances to do that. And one of the things we ought to do is, hey, look around our neighborhoods. I know we've got an elderly couple that lives across the street. And so my wife has baked some bread for them. We've gone to them and we've had a chance to go to the grocery store. Look for opportunities. Maybe it's your grandparents. Maybe it's someone else in your neighborhood. How can you help them through this time? It's also just that reminder, hey, God's at work here. God is doing good things, even though we don't see it. I sent in an email earlier today talking about some of the ways that people are responding in positive ways. We're spending time with family. We're slowing down. My brother-in-law was saying he never even knew he had all these people walking on the street, neighbors, and you see people writing these encouraging messages in driveways, and just some really neat ways that people are using this time to really look, how can I bless others? So as we move on and we get through and wrap up this part of the Old Testament, hey, a couple of things I'd like to emphasize that we saw in all three of these books. Hey, God does things his way and his time. We've just got to learn to trust him. God wants our obedience. He wants us to do the things he's called us to do because there's a purpose behind it. It's that reminder of the kind of people that God uses. God uses imperfect people to accomplish his perfect purposes. So in all of these things, man, let's just remember and let's really look for ways, how is God going to use us? And that's sort of a big question here. How does God want to use you? In this time where lives have been overturned and our daily lives are just so different than what they were just 3 weeks ago, how can God use you in your household, in your neighborhood, in your community as a whole? Man, let's just really ask God, how do you want to use us in your perfect plan? All right, guys, I hope you have an awesome spring break. I'm sorry we're not going to be back in school right afterwards, but I really look forward to that time that we're together again in class. I miss you. I love you. And I just hope you have an awesome break. All right, guys. Later.